Okay, addendum to the Great Book series. We're moving from the 19th to the 20th century. The book excerpt that we're going to be studying tonight is a book by the name of Eretz Tzvi. Eretz Tzvi means literally the land of the deer. The author of this book was Rav Aryeh Tzvi Frommer. His first two Hebrew names were Aryeh and Tzvi, and therefore, if you kind of read them together, Ar Tzvi. You know, it's a kind of an allusion rather than an acronym of his two Hebrew names. Eretz Tzvi is a biblical reference as well, and it's a metaphor for the land of Israel. And according to the sages of Israel, the reason that the land of Israel is called the land of the deer is not because, deer was the most prevalent wild animal in Israel, but because, and this I take it on faith from the words of the sages, if you talk to a taxidermist, they will tell you that taxidermist is a guy who stuffs dead animals, like trophies. When people go deer hunting or moose hunting or boar hunting, and they have them mounted on the wall, that's the art of the taxidermist. At any rate, it's not a guy who's picking up fares on the street of Manhattan. No, that's not a taxidermist.
I'm a taxidermist, so don't say anything negative about taxidermist.
Okay, I just hope, I'm not going to say anything negative, just don't negate what I'm about to say in the name of the words of the sages, please. Whether it's accurate or not, please let it pass. Okay, anyway, obviously, every time you skin the hide of the corpse of a dead animal, there's going to be some shrinkage, some dehydration. But it seems that in a deer, it's very, very pronounced, to the point where we say, in other words, if anyone was going to stuff a deer, the deer you're looking at is probably 20 to 30% smaller than the living deer was. To the point where when you look at a living deer, you scratch your head and you say, how can the skin of a deer contain its flesh? Okay? That's a metaphor for the land of Israel, because you say, how can the natural resources of the land of Israel maintain the entire Jewish population? Which is, a cop-out answer for a lot of Jews who want to stay in the diaspora. Well, we need a strong diaspora. Try to imagine if there was an influx of another 3, 4, 8 million Jews into Israel. It would be there would be a tremendous crisis of the infrastructure. The country wouldn't be able to survive. It would turn into a third world ghetto nation overnight, and so on and so forth. Anyway, that's what the word Eretz Tzvi means. Whether or not the author had some kind of affinity for this teaching of the sages when he gave his book this name, I have no idea. If they do, it's interesting. I just thought that would be a nice little nugget, factoid to take out of tonight's class, because it's going to get very incomprehensible very fast. Okay, after this. All right, let me talk about the author a little bit. I don't have a lot of biography on him. There is a biography written in the foreword of his book, and I must say, even though this is one of the most well-worn books in my personal library, because it's one of my favorite books around. If it's possible to fall in love with a human being, never having laid eyes on them, just from their literary output, I'm in love with this man. Okay? He was known as the Kozhaklov. Kozhaklov was a town in Poland. And probably, his greatest claim to fame, the only, biographical, tidbit that I'm fully aware of and that, really has a lot of meaning to me is that he was the last dean of the Chachmei Lublin yeshiva. Chachmei Lublin was a revolutionary yeshiva in Lublin, Poland. It was founded by Rav Meir Shapiro. That's the same person who started the Daf Yomi, the page-a-day Talmud cycle, which is, now tremendously popular among Jews the world over. And it was a visionary yeshiva. There was no yeshiva of its kind anywhere in Eastern Europe, and certainly not in Poland. I mean, just to name some of its other innovations, it was the first and only yeshiva in Eastern Europe that had a modern dormitory facility, that had a swimming pool, that had a gymnasium, and that had a 3D model of the Third Temple in Jerusalem. And the reason for that, because the curriculum was very heavy in the study of those tractates in the Talmud that had to do with temple service. Suffice it to say that it was such a good building that when the Nazis occupied Poland, they didn't tear it down, and after the war it became a medical school, which is, most yeshivas in Eastern Europe, became stables and warehouses, just to give you the kind of contrast of the quality of the building. At any rate, that's not really this author's credit, that's Rav Meir Shapiro. But after Meir Shapiro died young, he took over the helm of the yeshiva, and he led the yeshiva through its final days in the Holocaust. And he was also one of the spiritual lights of the Warsaw Ghetto. He perished, I don't remember 100% if it was in the Warsaw Ghetto uprising or in the Treblinka death camp. But at any rate, that's the biographical sketch of the Kosher Club. Okay, so let me tell you before we hand out the excerpt. Let me tell you what I think is so unique about this author, and why he speaks so much to me, and in particular the reason that I chose this excerpt is because I feel he brings out, there's like a classic, in a certain sense, stereotypical passage, from this book. The first thing that I love about this man is that he was the cockeyed optimist of Jewish spirituality. By that I mean, whereas certainly the zeitgeist today, I think it's fair to say, and probably for several centuries has been one of marginalization, one of nullification. This is no good, and that's no good, and your kosher standards are not high enough, and your Shabbos observance standards are not high enough, and no matter how good you seem to be doing and how hard you seem to be trying, there will always be some kind of entity or individual, playing a game of spiritual one-upsmanship, who is more than happy to tell you, no, I'm sorry, you don't measure up. Okay? His attitude was completely different. I'll just give you an example. In his halachic words, he has a responsa book by the same name, Shalos Teshuvos Eretz Tzvi, the responsa of Eretz Tzvi, where, among other things, he tries to give halachic justification for such questionable practices of Polish Jewry before the war, in the interwar period, of wearing talis cottons, for example. For those who are not familiar, talis cotton means there's a mitzvah to wear a four-corner garment. It's erroneously sometimes referred to as a prayer shawl. The real mitzvah is to wear it during all daylight hours. It's kind of inconvenient. So the halacha developed over time a talis cotton, a miniature, a smaller kind of talis. But the small talis is also supposed to be garment size. Okay? Can you see through? Alright? See, that's the stripes on my talis cotton. It basically covers all of me. A lot of Hasidim wear it as an outer garment, as an undergarment. But anyway, in terms of size, it's supposed to be something like a vest, at least, or a small serape. Right? It seems that it was very common among pre-war Polish Jewry to wear something that looked like the equivalent of a bib as a talis cotton, like a cantle around here. Okay? And it's passé. You will not find Torah observant Jews today who wear such talis cottons. Right? I mean, the joke they tell about it is like this. That I once found an Alta Yid in a nursing home, and he's wearing one of these talis cottons, and it was yellow with age, and it was in tatters, and the strings were unraveling. And somebody said to him, Rab Nochumke, ich kaufen a neuen talis cotton. He says, I want to buy you a new one. He says, Nein. You can't, you're not allowed to. God forbid, heaven forfend. You know how holy this talis cotton is? You can't. So I thought maybe it's dementia. They try a second day, try a third day. Finally they ask God, what do you mean? What's so holy about this? He says, you don't understand. When I was a 3-year-old boy, and they gave me my first haircut, and they left me payas, my holy mother, she in the enlightened Gan Eden, she gave me this talis cotton. It's my mother's talis cotton. She's been wearing it since he's 9 years old now, wearing the same talis cotton for 87 years. My mother's holy talis cotton. What can be holy than that? Okay, but at any rate, he wrote a 10-page responsum explaining how it's okay. It's okay. I'll prove to you it's okay. I should say that an otherwise Torah observant Jew is breaking the law? I'm not going to say that. I'll find a way to justify what they're doing. I'll give you another example. It's very common for pre-war Polish Jewry, and I can testify to this because my father, Zechron Levacha, used to do it with me. That even in places where there are no Eruvin are the halachic legal fiction boundaries that we make to make everything considered a private domain so that you can carry things outdoors on Shabbos. Right? So even in places where there was no Eruv, it was not uncommon to ask boys up until the age of bar mitzvah and girls up until the age of bas mitzvah carry something for me, which is ridiculous. You have to train children to observe Shabbos as if they'd be adults. You don't tell a 12-and-a-half-year-old boy, cook something for me on Shabbos, drive the car for me on Shabbos, right? But that was the equivalent of what they were doing. Only for this law of caring. I remember, as a 10, 11-year-old boy, one time my father, forgot to take his towel zekel, his towels bag to shul before Shabbos. He said, doodle, and then I'm in the towel zekel, And thank God my father was otherwise Torah observant Jew. I should say otherwise. It was Torah observant. Anyway, this seems to have been a very prevalent custom. And again, it's a head scratcher. How can this be? These are not, Reform Jews. These are not, Maskilim. These are not Enlightenment Jews. These were Hasidic Jews doing this. Again, a 10-page response, to explain how this can be. Mm-hmm. All right. So this is the first thing I love about the man. I love about him that instead of finding a little microscopic wart, and putting the microscope to it, instead he finds a wart this big and he does a little nice cosmetic surgery on it, and he makes it disappear. So that's the number one thing that I like about him. God bless you. The number two thing that I like about him, I think this will be very well illustrated by this piece. This is overtly illustrated by this piece. Is that, I think it was Ambrose Bierce who defined, he said, specialization means knowing more and more about less and less. And there's a lot of specialization even within Torah scholarship. The Talmudic theoreticians are not the theologians. The theologians are not the philosophers. None of those are the halachic decisors. The Mussarists, the ethicists, they're off in a corner doing their own thing. The idea of an interdisciplinary approach, a holistic approach that sees all the different branches of Torah as a seamless whole, is first of all, you need, a mind of a genius. You need an encyclopedic, breadth of knowledge. You need to know all the different disciplines of Torah before you can really take a nice interdisciplinary approach. But you also need a certain mindset. You also need to feel that Torah is a seamless whole. There are no strict divisions between halacha and agada and kabbalah and so on and so forth. And that's what you find in a lot. I can't say that's what you find in his responsa literature, because, to be frank, I'm not as well read in that branch of his literary output, as I am in this. But I see in his commentary on the Chumash that he allows Kabbalistic and ethical concepts to reflect on his understanding of halachic concepts, and more to the point in this piece, we're going to learn tonight, vice versa. He'll allow a halachic concept to lend new insight into a homiletic or ethical piece. And finally, what I like about him, or what I find very fascinating about him, is like this. This man was a genius. This man was a rav of a chief rabbi of many major Jewish communities. And yet, the humility that he has derives, in my opinion, and here's another important biographical note, is that he was a Sachat Shavah Chassid. He was a Chassid, doesn't have to be of particularly of the Sachat Shavah Rebbes, but the point is he was a Chassid. He was a follower. He was a disciple of Hasidic masters. So despite all of his own manifest genius, I think it's very arguable, certainly of his second Rebbe, the second Sachat Shavah Rebbe, that in terms of pure Talmudic acumen, he was his Rebbe's superior. I think most historians, most scholars will say that. Right? Nevertheless, the word, and we're going to see this repeat, this is not overt, because he's not talking about Hasidim and Rebbes overtly in this piece, although he does in a lot of other pieces. The humility of the man, and there's a concept called bitul in Hebrew. We're most familiar with it. Before Passover, we do something called bitul chametz. We renounce our ownership of the leaven. But really what the word means, bitul, means to nullify or to negate something. And in Hasidic literature, there's a virtue called bitul hayeshus. In English, it's translated as self-abnegation. A sense of hollowing out one's ego. And part of the test, ultimately the idea is to melt into the Godhead, to feel a loss of self when approaching Hashem, approaching God. But at least in terms of Hasidic relationships, the idea is to feel a sense of utter humility and self-negation in the presence of greatness, and as embodied by the Hasidic Rabbi, as embodied by the Master. So even though the doctrine of tzaddikism, as it's called in the Hasidic movement, this idea of of a spiritual Superman, and has a very rich literature, and a lot of other Hasidic books. A lot of books that talk about rabbis, and what rabbis are supposed to feel, and how rabbis are supposed to lead, and what their great spiritual powers are, and how their prayer is different, and how their Torah study is different, and so on. I haven't found so much in my reading something that talks about how a chassid is supposed to feel. How's the follower supposed to be a follower? How to achieve, how to live through, how to experience that kind of self-negation. And again, even though he's not talking about rabbis over here, you'll see what I mean as we get through the piece. Okay, before I hand out the handout, and I need a security blanket. Let me have the Hebrew original open in front of me. Can I borrow that? Just as a placekeeper here. Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's take a look. It happens to be that it's this week's Parshat we're studying an excerpt from. Okay. Shmos, chapter 6. I'll get you the page in a second. Starting with verse 13. Chapter 6. I'll give it to you in a second. Please, patience. Go easy on me. Page 283. Okay. Just to give you a little background here, okay? 283. In the Living Torah, it's on page 283. Okay? Moshe and Aaron have already been chosen as the deliverers of Israel, the redeemers of the Jewish people out of Egypt. Moshe and Aaron have already heard what's called the four expressions, the four languages of liberation. Okay? One of the main reasons that we have 4 cups of wine the night of Passover is because the exodus from Egypt was promised using 4 different Daled Lashono Shel Geula is what's called in Hebrew, the 4 expressions of redemption. Okay, so that's already happened. And they're about to go, they mean business, they're about to go to Pharaoh for the first time, basically and say, let my people go. And listen to this interruption over here. I'm going to start reading from verse 13. God then spoke to both Moses and Aaron. He gave them instructions regarding the Israelites and Pharaoh, king of Egypt, so that they would be able to get the Israelites out of Egypt. We now bring you a word from our sponsor. No, not the Jewish Heritage Center. Genealogy. These are the heads of their extended families. The sons of Israel, firstborn, Reuben, Enosh, Palu, Chetzron, Carmi. These are the families of Reuben. The sons of Simeon. What is this? I'm doing a shidduch with you. I'm breeding thoroughbred horses over here. What do I need genealogy charts for? In mitten drinnen, as we say in Yiddish. In the middle of everything, I'm giving you a yichus brief. I'm giving you a genealogy chart. Get to the action. All right? The action picks up again basically on the next page. Right before verse 26. The above are the heads of the Levite clans according to their families. This is then the lineage of Moses and Aaron, to whom God said, bring the Israelites out of Egypt en masse. They're the ones who spoke to Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Who needs a lineage? What are you getting involved with the lineage of Moses and Aaron? Is this diplomatic presentation of credentials before you speak to a head of state? I don't know. It's many quills have been broken to explain this insertion. What is this doing in the middle of the narrative of Moses and Moshe and Aaron's mission to Pharaoh, to the king of Egypt? So this is the point that our passage from the Kosher Clover is coming to us. Time is very short. We have a lot and very difficult material to cover. I'm not taking any questions till the end. Okay. At this point, I'm ready to hand it out. Please take one and pass it around. And to make matters worse, if the passage wasn't nebulous enough, it's yours truly who did the translation. So that's not too good either. But we'll try our best. Gewalt. Do I have any more? No. Yeah, actually I do have a few more. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
How many are we missing? Maybe some neighbors are going to have to share a little bit.
Does anybody else need? Oh, we're good. We have enough.
Okay, fine. I hope everyone has enough. Here goes. Our sages taught. Okay, I'm only going to refer to the footnotes when it's more than just telling you where the Divrei Chazal, where the words of our sages is found. Okay, if there's something to explain, then we'll look at the footnotes. Otherwise, you're free to take this home. Just you can ignore the footnotes. Our sages taught that as long as one of the tribes lived. Now, what I mean by the tribes throughout this passage, I mean the historical person who started the tribe: Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda. When the historical person Yehuda was living, when Shimon was living, that's what I mean by the tribes. I don't mean when you have 2.5 million Jews and 400,000 of them are Yehudim or Benjaminites. That's not what I mean by tribe. And I also don't mean in our common vernacular we use it as a synonym for being Jewish. I'm a member of the tribe. That's not what I mean. Okay. I mean when I say the tribes lived, I mean the historical persons, the 12 sons of Yaakov Avinu, the literal Bnei Yisrael, the literal children of Israel. Before that became a synonym for our nation. The 12 men who were the children of Israel, that's what I mean by tribes. As long as one of the tribes lived, the children of Israel, meaning our nation, were not enslaved to the Egyptians. Okay? That's what our sages teach us. As a matter of historical fact. The real enslavement, the real horrible exile experience, slavery experience that we had to endure under the Egyptians, that only began when the last of the tribes died. Who was the last of the tribes to die? That's an argument in the Medrash. But everyone agrees that whichever one died last, while they were alive, there was no heavy-duty slavery going on. Okay. We can expand upon this idea based on a passage in the Holy Zohar. And here's the quote from the Holy Zohar. If you want to know where it is in the Zohar, you can look at your footnote. In ancient books, this is the Zohar talking, it is found that these sons of Yaakov, the tribes, desired to gain dominance over him, Joseph, prior to his descent into Egypt. Stop, pause. I should say, that's redundancy. We're pausing, we're not stopping. For those of you who are not familiar, okay, one of the saddest episodes in the book of Genesis is the rivalry, the jealousy that existed between Joseph and his brothers, the other tribes of Israel. And for those of you who are not familiar with the narrative, basically Yaakov favored Yosef over all of his other sons. The classic case, psychology, child rearing 101, very bad to pick a favorite among your children. It's not even such a good idea for grandparents, but certainly for parents it's poison. And it started all kinds of sibling rivalry going on, and it ultimately led to the kidnapping of Yosef by his brothers, and his being sold into slavery to an itinerant band of Bedouins, to the point where he got sold several times until he ended up in Egypt. Okay? So you have to know two things about this passage of the Zohar before we move on. Talk about cockeyed optimism. If you ever want to, we would call this the work of a good political spinmeister, what we're about to read from the Zohar. It's a criminal act. What do you mean? It's a horrible thing. We have a tradition in the revealed part of the Torah that the Asara Haruge Malchus, that the 10 righteous martyrs in Talmudic times died to atone for the sins of the 10 brothers who sold Yaakov into slavery. We say as much, it's in our liturgy, we say as much every Yom Kippur, every Tisha B'Av. Basically in the revealed, in the unmystical part of the Torah, this is denounced as a horrible crime on the part of the brothers. All right? So he's going to turn it into something positive. That's the first thing you have to understand. The second thing that you have to understand is that there's a presumption that before you can sell someone, you must own someone. All right? So whenever there are slave traders, whenever there's white slavery, whatever you want to call it, whenever there are slave traders, okay, who does the original slave owner, or I should say, how does the original slave owner acquire the slave? Obviously not through monetary exchange. You're not buying them from anyone. You are conquering them. You take possession of them as chattel because you conquered them. Okay? Point number 2. Okay. In ancient books it is found that these sons of Yaakov, the tribes, desired to gain dominance over him, Joseph, prior to his descent into Egypt. For had he descended into Egypt without them first gaining dominance over him, the Egyptians would ultimately have been able to enslave the nation of Israel forever. 210 years was bad enough. and then an exodus. Horrible. 210 years of slavery. But absent this sale of Joseph, it would have gone on forever. How is that? Let's read on. However, being that they sold Joseph as a slave, you'll forgive me for slipping into the Talmudic sing-song, but that's really what this is. This is really a Talmudic piece. However, being that they sold Joseph as a slave, having gained dominance over him, although Joseph later became the king, viceroy, and the Egyptians were his subjects, and I put in parenthetically, slaves, and in Hebrew there's no difference between those two words. Subjects of the king are known as avadim, the same word as slaves. And if you really think about it, etymologically, subject is not much nicer, it's not much different. A subject means you've been subjected to somebody. Right? You're sub, you are below them in station, in hierarchy. Right? Thus we find that Israel subjugated them all. End quote. Stop for a second. Okay, now this is not there at Tzvi, this is not the Kosher Klovarov doing this. This is the Zohar actually subsuming and including a Talmudic, a halachic legal concept without really spelling it out. But I will spell it out for you. Okay, here's the notion. And we're talking about a thing. I want you for a moment to put off to your side your ethical and moral revulsion at the whole institution of slavery. Okay, let's try to, remember when you were in 9th grade in biology class and you had to dissect the frog and you were fainting and that's icky, so for science, try to be a little dispassionate. Okay, don't think about the moral abhorrence of slavery. Let's just think of the legal construct of slavery. Okay, there's a halachic dictum that says as follows. Kol masha kana eved kana rabba. Whatever the slave acquires, the owner acquires. And there's a very simple explanation of that. Being owned, you cannot own anything. Try to imagine if I would talk about the property rights of a dog, the property rights of an ox, of a mule. A mule has no property rights. You want to say that there's animal rights? We shouldn't be cruel to animals. That's something we can all understand. That's something that cuts across all kinds of legal systems. You want to talk about the saddle of the mule or the horseshoes on the horse vis-a-vis the property rights of the horse owner? That I can understand. But you can't seriously talk about a horse bringing a lawsuit against somebody for ruining his horseshoes. It's preposterous. Right? So sadly, that's what a slave is. The definition of a slave is you dehumanize the human being. You've brought a human being down to the level of a pot, of a pan, of a horse, of a cow. They're owned. Okay? Being owned, they cannot own anything. I'll give you a practical application, 2 practical applications of this law. Okay? There's a kind slave owner. He only works his slave 6 hours a day. The rest of the day, your time is off. Guy's walking down the street, and he finds a diamond ring, and he picks it up. The diamond ring belongs to the slave owner. I said, well, it was on off hours. What I do on my off hours is my business. You cannot own anything. Okay? Here's a quandary that the Talmud has. One of the ways that slaves can get liberated, can get emancipated from slavery is through monetary redemption. You give X amount of money to the owner. Basically, you buy yourself out of bondage. You buy yourself out of slavery. So the Gemara has a quandary of how does this work? Because if another free man is purchasing so that's a purchase. If he wants to unilaterally liberate him afterwards, that's his business. But it's not as though the slave was redeemed. Instead, what do you want to say? He gave money to the slave for the purpose of his own redemption. He didn't buy the slave out and then liberate him. He gave money to the slave that the slave should now turn around to his current owner and say, okay, here's what I'm worth, liberate me. All right? So the Gemara says, but how can that be? As soon as he puts the money into the slave's hand, it now belongs to the owner. The slave doesn't have a nanosecond to turn around and say, okay, I'm buying my freedom. Guys, I'm just giving you 2 halachic examples of what this means. Kol ma shekana eved kana rabba. Okay, so now we're doing a little math. Okay? Let's say a slave would pretend to be a free man. Okay? And go down to the slave market and purchase a slave. Who does slave number 2 belong to? The original owner. Okay? A owns B. So if B owns C, without ever having been liberated, C belongs to A. That's the arithmetic that we just read in the Zohar. Yosef was the slave of the other tribes because they sold him into slavery. They conquered him. They kidnapped him. Right? Like the darkest slave traders of the Ivory Coast in the 16th century. There was various warring tribes. One tribe won a war. Nebuch, the vanquished tribe, got sold to Portuguese slave traders on the west coast of Africa. How did they become slaves in the first place? Not because anybody paid money for them. They conquered them. So they owned them. Yeah, that was the concept. Same thing over here. The other tribes conquered Yosef. He was their slave. He rose. He had a meteoric rise. He became the king of Egypt, the viceroy of Egypt. Kings in the ancient world, potentates in the ancient world, the whole country were their slaves. Subject is just a touchy-feely, politically correct word. A subject is a slave. I own you. And certainly if you read the end of Genesis, you'll read about the land reform projects of Yosef. He literally bought away the freedom of all the subjects of Egypt. He literally arranged for it that he and the Pharaoh of Egypt owned the populace, of Egypt, with rare exceptions, the priestly class. But everyone else, during the years of famine, first they sold off all their land, and then they literally sold their bodies to the king in order not to die in starvation during the years of the famine. Okay. So, Joseph owns the Egyptians. But the tribes own Joseph. Now, slaves being chattel, they get passed along as part of an estate, right? When the tribes die, and they have children, and those children have children, and those children, the great-grandchildren of the tribes, really, as it were, own the Egyptians. So it's a sham, it's a facade, this idea of the children of Israel being slaves to the Egyptians. That's a fake role reversal. In point of fact, if we go on a title search, okay, it's the other way around. It's the children of Israel who own the Egyptians. That's the arithmetic that the Zohar is saying. Sounds obscurantist? Well, the Zohar is a mystical work. But that's what the Zohar is saying. So, it was all for the good. It was all redemption planning. Okay? The reason why they wanted to subjugate, why they wanted to take Yosef as a slave, is because paradoxically, the seeds of emancipation, of national liberation, were secreted away in that act of taking this one slave, Yosef. That's what the Zohar says. Blame it on the Zohar, don't blame it on me. That's what the Zohar says. Okay, let's move on. In other words, okay, I'm 4 lines before the end of the first paragraph. In other words, the tribes themselves who actually subjugated Joseph were considered to be the subjugators of the Egyptians, as explained above in the Zohar. Therefore, the Egyptians lacked the power to dominate them, that is, their descendants. Yet, once the last of the tribes died, the Egyptian enslavement of their descendants began. It may have been a sham, it may have been illegal, but it was very real. Okay? Nobody, while an Egyptian was whipping their back raw, or flogging them, nobody was going to say, hey, how dare you do that? I'm the owner and you're the slave. Okay? Oh yeah? How's another 39 lashes seem to you? Right? The fact is that they did subjugate them. So what's going on? Now the Kosher Clover starts talking. And you have to understand, I'm reading, but I'm commenting as I go along. Remember I told you he's the cockeyed optimist of Jewish spirituality? He's not just explaining to us why a Jew is allowed to wear a bib as a talis katan, or why a bar mitzvah boy minus 2 days can still carry on Shabbos. He's a cockeyed optimist about the spiritual grandeur of every Jew. And that's going to come out in this piece as well. However, the roots of Israel are concealed within all children of Israel. These roots consist of the patriarchs, the 12 tribes, and the 70 souls that descended into Egypt. Okay, for those of you who are not familiar, when the famine in the land of Canaan, it was pan-world famine, but in the land of Canaan, it caused Yaakov and his household to descend into Egypt. At that time, when Yaakov moved down from the land of Israel We always call it a descent. Anytime you leave the land of Israel, it's a descent. Going from any other country into the land of Israel is called an ascent. To this day, immigrants to the land of Israel are called olim, ascenders, those who rise. That's in modern Hebrew, that's the word for an immigrant to Israel. Okay. So when Yaakov and his household moved down into Egypt, there were 70 souls, and that's considered a significant number in the development of the children of Israel, what we call today the Jewish people. Okay. Those are our roots. There can be millions and millions and millions of individual Jews. But each individual Jew has a root, well concealed, but there within them. There's patriarch and matriarch stuff within us. There's 12 tribe stuff within us. And there's 70 soul stuff within us. He's going to be concentrating for the rest of the piece on the patriarch business. But in order for the lights of the patriarchs and the tribes to shine in the hearts of the children of Israel, the children, with longing and of their own free will, must abnegate themselves to the patriarchs. That is, to walk in their footsteps and to constantly say, when will my deeds reach those of the patriarchs? That's a famous Talmudic, Midrashic actually aphorism. Chayev Adam Lomar Mosai Yagiu Masai L'Masai Avosai Avram Yitzchak Yaakov. Every person is required to say to themselves constantly, when will my deeds reach the deeds of the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? This is a literal translation of this aphorism of the sages. The holy Rebbe of Kotsk, okay, when he says the holy Rebbe of Kotsk, that's his grand Rebbe. He was I don't mean grand Rabbi like Grand Rabbi Menachem Schneerson or Grand Rabbi Yoel Teitelbaum. I mean like grand as in grandfather. In spiritual line, he was a chassid / disciple of the Sachachover Rebbe, Avnei Nezer, and the Sachachover Rebbe was the son-in-law, heir of his father-in-law, the Kotzker Rebbe. Okay? So, the Kotzker Rebbe explained, that what this really means is that our deeds must in some way make contact with those of the patriarchs. It's hubris for me to say that I'm a spiritual superman like Abraham. The word in Hebrew is yagia. Too bad Saul isn't here tonight. He's always our Hebrew translator. Masa yagia, masai l'masai avosai. When will my deeds reach? It sounds like reach the same threshold as those of the patriarchs. The Kotzker Rebbe said it's impossible. What is that supposed to mean? I'm going to be like Isaac. I'm going to be willing to sacrifice like Abraham. I'm going to be willing to sacrifice my only son on an altar. I'm going to be like Isaac. I'm going to stretch out my throat to be slit. What are we talking about over here? It's ridiculous. Although the truth is, in Jewish history, there were Jews who were equal to that challenge and more. But anyway, to say that it's something required of every single Jew seems a bit much. So he says, no, that's not what it means. The word yagia in Hebrew can mean to reach or can mean to touch. Okay, there's a new modern vernacular in modern Jewish dating called, are you shomer nagia? Do you observe the law of not touching one another premaritally? Forget about premarital sex, premarital touching. All right? It's called shomer nagia. I observe the law of nagia. We won't touch one another. Touch. That's a nagia. What I just did now, one of my hands is being nogeya in my other hand. That's nagia. Yeah? So the Kotzker Rebbe said that's what a person has to say. My deeds have to touch. They have to connect. Not to achieve the threshold of. Alright? Here's the difference, okay? Of the two explanations. Let's say we're talking pole vaulting. Alright? I wish I had a blackboard here, okay? Pole vaulting. According to the first interpretation, if the horizontal bar is set at 18 feet, I've got to strive to hit 18 feet. If you take the second approach, I have to try to hit the bottom 2 inches of the vertical bar of the pole vault. That's also touching the deeds of they were pole vaulters. I have some kind of touch, some kind of contact with pole vaulting. That's enough. I have to be able to touch. Close enough to touch. Similar enough to touch. Now the Rosh ruled that a garment that is negated to the person wearing it is considered to be touching the person and is therefore to be treated as tactile contact rather than as a burden. Okay, now I just said a mouthful, and this is what I mean when I say that he looked at the Torah as a seamless whole. He's talking very mystical, he's talking very homiletical, and in the middle of the whole discussion, he inserts a piece of dry, very, very technical halacha. Let me flesh it out a little bit for you. I can't, time doesn't allow me to do it total justice. But suffice to say as follows. Giving you a quick and incomplete primer, however that word is pronounced, on the laws of Tumah and Tahara. Okay? In Jewish law, it's fully actually 1/6 of the 6th section Talmud. There's a whole body of law that deals with Tumah and Tahara. Tumah and Tahara means ritual purity and impurity. Okay? This is the most abstract part of halacha, because nobody can see purity and impurity. Nobody can measure. You can't taste it, you can't feel it, you can't touch it. It's impervious to any kind of sensory perception, purity and impurity. But we believe that the Torah talks about purity and impurity and that it exists, whether we see it or not. Okay? Now, there are transmitters of ritual impurity. A human corpse is the most intense transmitter of ritual impurity. How does a human corpse transmit ritual impurity? Well, there are a lot of different ways. You can touch the corpse. You can be under the same roof as a corpse. Depending on what the transmitter of impurity is, there are different modes of transmission. And depending upon how the impurity is transmitted, will determine the level. It keeps on descending, if you will. Okay, if somebody comes in time, if somebody touches a corpse, he gets the level called a rishon tumah. He's a 1st degree impure. He touches something else, that's a 2nd degree impure. After 2nd degree, there's no more transmission of impurity, and so on. There are certain types of impure people, based on certain bodily emissions and other ways of becoming impure, that there's a difference between if they carry a load on themselves, that's one way of transmitting impurity. Okay? If I carry something, even if I'm not in direct contact with them, I'm carrying 20 blankets on my back. Okay? The first blanket has a level of impurity based on being in physical contact with me. It doesn't matter if I have it on my shoulder, or if I touch it on the table, or if I keep it in my pocket. And the 20th blanket in that pile, even though it never came into physical contact with me, it's my load. By the fact that I'm weight bearing under it, that's also a transmission of impurity. Okay? And there again, suffice it for our class tonight to say that there are different levels of impurity transmitted by those two different techniques. So the Rosh says as follows. That a garment is negated to the person touching it. Okay? So in other words, even this part of the garment, okay, even the part of the garment that's over my shoulders, or if I have a hood, a cloak with a hood on it, all right, you can say my head is bearing the weight of the cloak on top of me. All right, this part of the garment, it's a load on my shoulders. All right, no, it's not considered a load. All right, it's negated. It's peripheral to the person. All right. Even if it's billowing, even if it's not directly touching the person, it's touching the person. Something that's totally peripheral, ancillary, unimportant vis-a-vis the person, is considered touching the person, whether it's physically touching the person or not. Okay, that's a abstract, hard halakhic concept. If that's all you learned tonight, you would say that's morally neutral. That's neither here nor there. I don't know. So it's a rule of impurity. It has nothing to do with anyone's spiritual level, has nothing to do with ethics, has nothing to do with my self-identity, my group identity. It's a law. I don't know. It's a very dry, abstract technical law. All right? Now listen to what he does with this dry, abstract technical law. From here we can derive that one who abnegates themselves to the patriarchs and pines to walk in their footsteps, so that they may in some way attach themselves to them, is considered to be in contact touching the patriarchs. In other words, a human being wearing garments. The garments are not me. The garments are, relatively speaking, totally unimportant to the person. I can wear this jacket today and another jacket tomorrow, this blouse today, another dress tomorrow. It's not me. I take it off, I put it on, right? It's unimportant, it's peripheral compared to me. So it's touching me, whether it's touching me or not. Now, within human beings, you can willfully make yourself peripheral. You can make yourself, as it were, no more than a garment. If you make yourself no more than a garment, it's a state of mind to perceive yourself that way. You make yourself no more than a garment, you're touching he or that which you are cloaking, which you made yourself peripheral to. That's what he draws out of this halacha. So a Jew who's thinking, okay, I am unimportant. I'm a little digit, okay? I'm a little cloak in this great ideation, in this great movement started by the patriarchs, this monotheistic movement, this nation of eternity called Israel, called the Jewish people, that was started by Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So this generation, it looks like Jews with the knit yarmulkes and nice blazers. And 200 years ago, it looked like Jews with silk kapatas and fur hats. And 5,000 years ago, it looked like Jews with turbans and galabias in the desert and sandals, and so on. I'm characterizing the generations by their changing outfits. I'm using it as a metaphor. Just as the changing outfits are ultimately unimportant, right? In a certain sense, if the people think of themselves that way, the people, as an individual generation, are also ultimately unimportant. It's the patriarchs. It's Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov. I relate to God, Elokei Avraham, Elokei Yitzchak, Elokei Yaakov. It's about the patriarchs. Right? I negate myself vis-a-vis the patriarchs. Obviously, if I negate myself vis-a-vis the patriarchs, I want to walk in their way. I don't have my own agenda. Not so interested in my own agenda. From here we can derive that one who abnegates themselves to the patriarchs and pines to walk in their footsteps, so they may in some way attach themselves to them, that is the patriarchs, is considered to be in contact with, touching the patriarchs. They're not a burden. They're not someone who the patriarchs are carrying and utterly removed from the patriarchs. They can be a million generations away. And it's true that they're carrying us with their merits, the merits of the binding of Isaac and so on. But if we negate ourselves to the patriarchs, we're in, like the garment is on my skin, it's touching me, we're touching them. That's how we touch the patriarchs. That's how we achieve this mandate to the sages, when will my deeds touch those of the patriarchs? That's how you achieve it, through self-negation. They will then be able to shine like the patriarchs. What he's saying is, we have the roots of the patriarchs within us. But it's buried under layers of our own experience, of our own egos, of our own disappointments, of our own crises of faith. It's in there, somewhere deep inside. But how do you make it shine forth? You make it shine forth by touching the patriarchs anew. And you touch the patriarchs anew through self-negation. But there's a problem. There's self-negation, and then there's self-negation. Listen to this metaphor. Yet once the Jews were enslaved to the Egyptians, and had negated themselves to the Egyptians as an embryo in its mother's uterus. Now here I do want to look at the footnote. Okay, take a look on the second page at footnote number 6. Okay, in Dvarim 4:34. If anyone wants to look it up and compare my translation with that of Rabbi Kaplan, I'll tell you where to look for it. Dvarim 4:34. Page 891. Page 891, verses 33 and 34. Has any nation ever heard God speaking out of a fire as you have, and still survived? Has God ever done miracles, bring one nation out of another nation? Now, he just deletes a word. In the Hebrew it reads, Mikerav Gai, from the midst of another nation. Okay, now take a look at my footnote number 6. Okay, I bothered to copy the Hebrew here. And here is the older, King James-like translation. Or hath God essayed to go and take him a nation from the midst of another nation, by trials, by signs, and by wonders. Interpreted to mean a nation from the viscera of another nation, the innards. Kerev can be translated as the midst, but kerev can also mean the internal organs. When we talk about sacrifices, when we talk about preparing sacrifices to be brought on the altar, we say, V'hakerev ha'kra'ayim yirchatz b'mayim. The innards, the intestines, and the thighs should be flushed with water before they're placed on the altar. So kerev, the Hebrew word kerev, can mean amidst, from among, or kerev can literally mean from the innards. So, in Medrash Shochatov, in Medrash Tillim, and Yalkut Shimoni, the Midrashic sages say that the reference in this pasuk, Gai mi kerev Gai, means God took us out of the viscera of another nation. And the metaphor is like a shepherd birthing a calf, it says. Calf is sitting there in utero, in the womb of the cow. The shepherd has got to insert his hand in and birth the calf. Schlep the calf out. That is one of the metaphors for the exodus from Egypt. We were so subsumed, as a slave nation, we were so dominated by the Egyptians. Not just economically dominated. Culturally, spiritually, in every possible facet of human experience. We so lacked independence. We were so subsumed among the Egyptians that we were like a baby in utero. You don't like the calf and cow. You can think of a human mother and her baby. Until the baby is born, right? It's like part and parcel of the mother. That's how we were in Egypt. There's no greater self-abnegation than that. As a matter of fact, modern psychologists talk about the maturation process in adolescence. Children moving from childhood to adulthood, the first and foremost thing they're looking for is something called individuation. I'm an individual. I'm not my parents' kid anymore. I'm my own person. Right? So even postpartum, even after you're born, there's a very strong sense of, I'm just an extension of, I'm just ancillary to my parents. Certainly before you're born. You're not here yet. You haven't appeared on the stage yet as an individual thing. Okay. Yet once the Jews were enslaved to the Egyptians and had negated themselves to the Egyptians as an embryo in its mother's uterus, and as this is the ultimate of all possible forms of self-abnegation. I can say self-abnegation, I don't have my independent agenda, I want to live my life the way Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob lived their life. That's all very nice. But you're a piker in terms of self-abnegation compared to an embryo in the uterus. Huh? And as this is the ultimate of all possible forms of self-abnegation, a uterus is literally the thigh of its mother. Okay, a Talmudic dictum, you'll see there are at least 4 different places in Shas, footnote number 7, where this is spoken about. Again, it would take me too long to explain everything. I'm just going to cite one example. Okay? It's actually an argument in various places in the Gemara, and I don't want to get too politically incorrect, but we can certainly understand how this might impact the abortion debate, whether we look at an embryo as a thigh of the mother or something independent. I'll just give you one example. The Gemara says, if a person designates an animal in his herd as a sacrifice, right, as a sin offering, for example, and it's a female animal and it's pregnant. So if you hold uber yerachimo, if you hold that the baby in utero is like a thigh of the mother, so even postpartum, even after the baby is born, right, we don't look at it as if the guy sanctified 2 different animals. But if you look at it as though the baby is something independent, even in utero, so then when it's born, he can choose either to sacrifice either the mother or the baby. Because we look at it as if he took 2 different animals from his herd and said, well, if something goes wrong with the first animal, I have the choice of which one to actually sacrifice. Whereas if you look at it as the thigh of the mother, when it's born, it has no sanctity. It can't. It's like if you would cut off the leg of the mother, he's going to say, okay, I'm going to bring that for a sacrifice. You can't do it. Okay. At any rate, again, a very highly halachic Gemara that he just brings into the discussion as if He's not talking homiletics here. This self-abnegation superseded their self-abnegation vis-a-vis the patriarchs. Hey, turn the page. We just have another paragraph for Sotagon. Presently, okay, remember, it's been a lot of material since then, but just to bring us back so we can bring this in for a landing. He's trying to address the point, what's with this lineage recapitulation before Moshe and Aaron go to visit the Egyptian Pharaoh the first time. Why is the Torah reviewing all of this? Presently, when there arose a divine will to redeem the Jews prior to the appointed time. Okay? The Jews left Egypt before they were supposed to. They were supposed to be in slavery for 400 years. In fact, they were only in slavery for 210 years. So, they fast-tracked their redemption. The divine stratagem was to reawaken the tribal roots of Israel. What does that mean? What do I mean by stratagem? There's only one way I can get out early. If I'm your slave, I'm your slave. If it says in the prophecy that we're going to be slaves for 400 years, they're going to be slaves for 400 years. But what if I pull a role reversal? What about if I'm not your slave, you're my slave? Okay, then obviously I'm a free man.
Well, the abnegation is to the patriarchs.
No, here the abnegation is to the tribes.
But there's a switch now, to the tribes.
Right. Stratagem was to reawaken the tribal roots of Israel. It wasn't the patriarchs who sold Jacob into slavery. It was the other tribes that sold Jacob into slavery. For this reason, the first of the 4 expressions of the redemption is, I will pull you out from beneath the burden of the Egyptians. Okay, for those of you familiar with the 4 Lashonos of Gula, V'hotzesi, V'itzalti, V'goalti, V'lokachti. The first pasuk reads, and you can look at it in, did I give you? Okay, Shmos 6:6. Let's read it inside. Show you what I mean. Quickly, back to Shmos. Page 283. 281. 281 at the bottom, verse 6. Therefore say to the Israelites in my name, I am God. I will take you away from your forced labor in Egypt. Okay, Rabbi Kaplan says, I will take you away. He translates it, the Rabbi Frommer, who we're learning tonight, I will pull you out. So it says, I will extricate you. I will pull you out. I will birth you. You are a calf, and I will birth you. I will pull you out, so that now you become something independent again. I will pull you out from beneath the burden of the Egyptians. That is, to alter your identity from that of an embryo in utero. But how can you do that? It's a vicious cycle. If I'm an embryo, how do I get born? How do I become something independent? Well, if the embryo mother metaphor is another way of saying, I'm the slave and they're the owner, the way to do that is to reverse the roles. To say, no, I'm the owner and they're the slave. How do you do that? By letting the light of the tribalism, if you will, the tribe identity of each individual Jew shine forth. It was the tribes who owned Yosef. It was Yosef who owned the Egyptians. And therefore the tribes owned the Egyptians. If I get in touch with my inner tribeness, all right, I'm no longer a slave. I'm the slave owner. I'm the free man. And they're the slaves. Once the quality of this self-abnegation disappeared, the light of the tribes began shining through them immediately. Intrinsically, the children of Israel have a greater proclivity for self-abnegation vis-a-vis their ancestors, the tribes, than vis-a-vis their taskmasters, the Egyptians. It is only because of their self-abnegation vis-a-vis the Egyptians was qualitatively more intense as an embryo in utero that their relationship to the patriarchs and tribes was superseded. When they were liberated from this level of self-abnegation as a neonatal calf that is no longer in utero, the neonatal means, newborn. Their self-negation vis-a-vis the tribes was reawakened as a matter of course. Once this was achieved, their complete redemption became a historical imperative. For it is as if one of the tribes was still alive. Remember how we started? As long as one of the tribes was still alive, there was no slavery. So this yichus brief, as I call it in Yiddish, this genealogical chart, right, is the Torah's way of saying they were getting in touch with their inner tribe. their tribal identity. And again, I don't mean tribal, we're all Reubenites or we're all Gadites. I am Reuven. I am Levi. I am Ephraim. I am Gad. Pick one of the 12 tribes of Israel. This little passage over here, this interlude, where the ancestry of Moshe and Aaron are presented, is really not just about Moshe and Aaron. It's about the Jewish people as a whole. Their tribeness, they're getting in touch, they're having a contact, they're having a touch with their inner tribeness. It's as if the tribes are still alive. The tribes are alive, there's no slavery.
Yeah.
There can't be slavery while the tribes are alive, because the actual title holder of the Egyptians are still here. One of them is still here. This is why the Torah spells out the lineage of the tribes, for this was the beginning of the redemptive process, to shine the lights of the tribes through them. Okay, like I said, to my way of thinking, this is totally incomprehensible, I know that. But besides that...
But there must be a simpler explanation also.
Oh, sure. Today we were doing great authors and their books. We're learning the Kosher Clover tonight. To me, this is a classic piece of Kosher Clover scholarship, because again, he's got this seamless switchback from mystical to halachic to homiletic. There's no boundaries. This is totally interdisciplinary. He's talking about the greatness of Jews. A Jew can touch through ego transparency. I can become a Reuven. I can become a Shimon. I become an Abraham and an Isaac, or a Sarah and a Rachel. Right? That's a unseen but inherent greatness, spiritual grandeur of each individual Jew. And also, although it's not so overt, he's talking patriarchs and tribes and not rabbis and chassidim, but this is the language of a chassid relating to his rabbi. This self-abnegation, this feeling peripheral, and thus being able to touch and somehow latch on to the greatness, to the eternity of it all. That's a chassid perceiving their relationship to the rabbi. Okay, now I'll be glad. I had the floor and I bored. I saw some of you who were nodding off, and I totally understand this very, very arcane stuff. Sometimes I say that love is blind, and I said like my love for this author and my time constraints maybe made me translate a piece that was really not suited, just too dense, to really explain, at least by this feeble teacher. Now I'm going to give you my excuse. Collation tonight is a very special collation. I want all of you, please join me in the next room and raise a toast to me. My oldest son got engaged last night.